Hi, everyone. Hello. Thank you for coming to the Austerity and Debt panel. And it's going to be great. I'm not going to promise things, but I am going to promise things, so it's going to be good. So my name is Noni, and I work at Positive Money, which is a monetary reform think tank. And today I'm joined by Özlem Onuran, Ona Parvan, and Jonah Montgomery. And just before I go into introducing the speakers, I thought I'd have my 2 cents about the sort of austerity and debt in general. And when I was reading this on the way here, and I was just thinking, what really stuck with me is the idea of debt as presented as like structurally integral to the functioning of the economy today, and how this has shifted from the public to the private. Because as individuals as well, we've sort of internalized the idea that to be fulfilled, to succeed, and to also just to do anything in this debt-based economy, that we also need to be in debt. And I thought I'd sort of say this statistic that I once found. So in Hackney, which is the area in the borough in London which is most disadvantaged and is suffering from gentrification, it is the area in London with the highest density of credit companies. And it sort of shows how the more structurally affected you are by a debt-based economy based on your race, class, gender, sexuality, the more likely you are to need to take up more debt to be able to escape so to escape debt, you need to take more debt, and it's like the cyclical structure that keeps on happening again. And especially, I thought it was really funny as well how debt has also been absorbed into meme culture. So, you see so many memes about, students like, I can't afford food, lol, which is really, it really sucks because we shouldn't be in debt. It's not a structural a necessity. It's not meant to be like this, but then we're always presented it as it is. So today, we're going to be talking about the alternatives to that. And for that, is there a better way for us to feel fulfilled? Is there a better way for us to not be in this constant cycle of being in debt, being in more debt, being in more debt, and just more debt? And to do that, we're going to hear from these 3 brilliant women who have come far to come and spread the beautiful word of truth. And on my left, I'm joined by Özlem Onuran, who's a professor of economics at Greenwich University, and she's the director of Greenwich Political Economic Research Centre. And her research focuses on inequality, wage growth, and gender and crisis. And on my right, I'm joined by Jonah Montgomery, who's a lecturer in economics at Goldsmiths and is the deputy director at the Policy Economic Research Centre, PERC. And her research focuses on household debt and the relationship to Anglo-American financialization. And over here, we have Ona Parvan, who is a doctoral researcher at Goldsmith and part of the Centre for Cultural, and was formerly part of the Centre for Cultural Studies. And her research focuses on primitive accumulation in post-communist Romania. And so I'm really excited to hear from these brilliant women and see what they have to say. And thank you all for coming. Also, just the mics aren't working, so if you can't hear us, just do this and then we'll speak louder. And and if you can't hear and you're sat further back, maybe move a bit further to move
come closer.
Forward. Yeah, just come closer. We're not scary, or maybe I don't know. Quite terrifying. To begin with, we're going to start with Özlem.
Thank you so much, Nona. And I have to say, this is my second year at Goldsmiths, again on a very hot July day. And the last time I came, I was saying, who else will come on a hot July day here? And the organizers are brilliant, so every year they manage to put together very interesting discussions and a really brilliant audience. So thanks for having me again here. And I have to say also credit to the organizers again of the conference. It's very rare that we have an all-women panel when we talk about economics. Actually, yes, thank you for that. And I struggle with my co-organizers when I organize conferences to have at least one woman in each panel, because it's actually embarrassing to have a man-only panel. And many men don't notice that, actually. It's very discomforting for the women audience, but brilliant. Thanks all the organizers for here with us. And I have to say one more thing, not a commercial break, but last year when we came here, I was very excited because we had started a new master's program in economics, brand new, pluralist, from the core courses to the optional courses throughout. You learn rigorous mainstream economics, but also alternative economics, and can compare and contest them and discuss real-world issues. So if you want to study things like that, please come and join us. Of course, we would be very happy to recruit students who are part of that brilliant community of rethinking economics and the broad family. Okay, I will talk about the background of household debt, if you like, and how that relates to inequality, and why should we worry about that beyond, of course, the very obvious brutal facts Noni was talking about from a macroeconomic instability perspective. If you like, I'll start with this flows in the neoliberal economic policies that has led to rising inequality, and it's at the background of our growth model here in the UK, but not just in the UK, many other places in Europe and elsewhere, that growth has been fueled by households taking on more debt. And this is happening in the context of actually the public sector, the governments, praising a taboo and actually a float wrong taboo of public sector budget balance, a taboo against borrowing. So is there any policy alternatives against that? Well, yes, there are. And as I will briefly say a few words about this, but most of it hopefully will be in the discussion in the interest of time. But I've already said, well, we teach these in our both bachelor programs and master's programs. But if you're a lifetime learner, because we don't only have people whom I can recruit to our talk programs here, we have activist campaigners who spend this beautiful sunny day still trying to learn. And we are having a new series that we call Economics for Campaigners. This is for people with no background in economics. It's free. We have a program about that in our website. All we want is people come share what we have to say, and then hopefully campaign around it and change us something. Okay, here is the background of or decades-long neoliberal economic policies in terms of inequality. I'm going to pick up just one dimension of inequality, that is the inequality between labor versus capital. This is the picture of the share of labor income, wages, in the pie of national income. The blue line dates back from 1960 to today, 2015 in the graph, is the share of wages in national income for the 15 old member states of or Western member states of the European Union. It still includes the UK there. Probably the word old will mean something different in a year from now. And the red line is the rate of growth of the pie of the national income, that's the GDP. If we look at the blue line, something very remarkable is happening there. From the peak of about mid to late 1970s, for more than 3 decades by now, almost 4 decades by now, the share of labor in national income has been continually decreasing. And it's not a small decrease, that's a redistribution away from labor towards capital of the orders of magnitudes of about 10 percentage point of national income. Well, what happened along with that to economic performance? Very simply put, growth of GDP has been lower along with the fall in the wage share, and it has been also more volatile, not to mention the big dip there in 2008 in the red line with the Great Recession. Now, here is what Financial Times has written about our research on this increasing inequality and its destabilizing, macroeconomically destabilizing nature. Capital gobbles labor's share, but victory is empty. There I was referring to a piece of research I have done with my colleague Yorgos Galanis, who happens to be now teaching at Goldsmiths, by the way, for the International Labour Office of the United Nations. So capital is gobbling labor share is falling, the mirror image of that is profit share is increasing, but victory is not a stable victory, it is empty. Why? Okay, here is what happens. Pluralism is important to put things into context and compete them and then test against real-world data, if you like. So if you have this increasing profit share and falling wages, I showed you on the data, mainstream economists, neoclassical economists, if you want to simplify it, who look only at one side of the economy, the supply side, so sees wages as costs to businesses. They say this is great, they're falling, it's going to have a positive effect on investment, it's going to stimulate international competitiveness and exports, economy will grow, jobs will increase, benefits will trickle down to everyone. Well, did it trickle down? If you look at the graph I showed you, this is very puzzling from a neoclassical perspective. Growth has been lower despite a rising profit share along with the fall in labor share. Well, we are not one-handed. We have both our hands, both sides of the economy. We work with models we call structuralist. They have also the demand side of the economy in the picture, not just the supply side. We call them post-Keynesian economics, having learned from both Keynes and Marx. If you want to be a bit more precise, it builds a lot on the work of an economist called Mihail Paletsky, a post-Keynesian economist. Now, in our work, we admit that wages are a cost item for businesses, but it's not just a cost item. They have a dual role. They are also a very important source of demand. So this is why we have the claim to have a general theory as opposed to a narrow, one-sided theory. So we say if you decrease wages, three things happen. The first is something mainstream neoclassical supply-side economists totally miss. If you decrease wages, that will lead to lower consumption of households. Well, why? Because the poor consume less out of their income in proportion to their income compared to the rich. To rephrase it for the context of between workers and capital, workers consume a higher share of their income compared to the capitalists or their employers who consume out of their profit income. Okay, so consumption of households would fall, other things being constant, if you cut wages, if you moderate wage growth. There may be a positive impact on investment, but again, businesses aren't as narrow-minded as the neoclassical economists think they are. They don't just look at profitability, they also look at sales prospects. If you're squeezing households' consumption demand by cutting their wages, markets for businesses will be hampered as well. And third, okay, there will be a boost as stimulus to foreign demand. Exports may increase when labor costs decrease, but that will depend on two things. First, of course, how sensitive your exports are to prices and how much your prices would fall when you cut wages, which depends on the labor intensity of what you're selling in the international markets. So this total effect may sum up to anything between negative or positive or zero. It's ambiguous theoretically. This is why I'm saying we work with a general growth theory here. Lower wages could actually lead to overall a negative effect if this negative domestic consumption effect of households is very dominant. This is what we call a wage-led demand regime. That means lower wages will lead to lower growth, fewer jobs. Well, the effect could be positive theoretically. This is what we would call a profit-led economy. If you like, the mainstream economists tell you all our economies are profit-led. So I say this is an empirical question. Is it? And this is what we did for the International Labour Office and more recently with my student Thomas Obst for the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. What we find actually is the negative consumption effect is very strong. The positive investment stimulus either isn't there or very weak. And for large countries, large European economies or large countries in the world like the US, actually the export effects are pretty much dwarfed by the negative effect on domestic demand, combination of consumption and investment. So most of our economies are wage-led, but most importantly, all together in the world, if you like, or in Europe as an aggregate, we are having a wage-led economy. This is because we are doing all our trade together. Well, intra-European trade is very high. You hear a lot about that during Brexit. And of course, if you look at the world, work doesn't trade with anyone else. If we all dump our prices, our wages to gain a competitive edge vis-a-vis each other, nothing happens because we are all doing the same race to the bottom in the wage share. This is, if you like, a fallacy of composition. What may work for a small, very open economy doesn't work if we all do the same. Right? So there is a quite clear limit to how much mileage you can get by trying to gain a competitive international edge based on wage competition only. Okay, so you could have said, here is the relation to debt to me. Well, but we did grow and households are consuming despite the rising inequality and falling wage share. How did that happen? Because I'm telling you that would potentially have led to deficiency in demand and stagnation in growth. Well, this was circumvented by basically two types of growth models, both taking place in the same context of a wage-led demand regime and in the context of a finance-dominated neoliberal growth or accumulation regime. One is a debt-driven growth model, the other is an export-driven growth model. So there are many examples of that. We are living in one of them, the UK. US is another example in the center. There are also examples of that in the periphery of Europe, Spain, Greece, in the developing world, Turkey, South Africa, of course Eastern Europe, again in the periphery of Europe, which we will hear today later, is a classical example of that. Households, in the absence of a healthy wage growth, relied on debt just to eventually start being able to pay debt. And their consumption did not fall, but they are very fragile, burdened with debt. And I'm speaking to a young audience here. You're burdened with, of course, student loans. So there are many facets of that. Now, this debt and growth in consumption helped a different group of countries who are also facing the same deficiency of demand at home because they're cutting wages and they are relying on exporting to this debt-led, consumption-led growth economies in the UK or in the periphery of Europe and the world. So here we have, of course, notoriously Germany in the core, but also several other European economies. I was exactly speaking in Austria yesterday on that. Japan is another example. In the periphery, China or South Korea, who is, by the way, remarkably trying to now change this. It's one of the few countries who have elected a progressive government. And last week I was in South Korea, second time a year, talking about equality-led development. Because actually people are noticing that this whole model is based on property bubbles, capital flows from export-led surplus economies towards debt-led deficit economies in terms of their international balances. If you think debt-led growth in the UK or in Greece, for that matter, is unstable, well, the German export-led growth model is breeding exactly on the same fragility, because in the absence of a healthy German domestic wage-led demand, because they are having the same aggressive cuts in wages, they need the debt in the UK or in Greece. The Germans think Greece isn't sustainable, while their export-led World Masterschaft is not sustainable either, and they lost actually in the World Cup to South Korea. So that's all actually very fragile, and actually Great Recession did happen breeding on that fragile ground. I could tell you a little bit about also the financialization aspect of it, but I'm sure Joanna will talk a lot more about that. Now, income inequality is leading these two fragile debt-led versus export-led models. On the side of the financial markets, there is the other facet of inequality, that is wealth concentration. The wealthy people of the world are seeking high returns for their savings. This is creating demand for the very risky, dodgy, toxic assets that we have seen failing us in the Great Recession, the so-called asset-backed securities and the CDOs. So you wouldn't be able to, of course, have that much long terms of debt-led growth if you didn't have this creation of asset-backed securities, which requires the demand of the rich. And asset-backed securities wouldn't be created if you didn't have this household debt increasing, first in the first in the US, but also elsewhere in the world. So these are all different facets of inequality that brought us to the Great Recession. Sadly, we are nowhere close to changing that. Now, is there a way out of this debt-led, fragile model? Well, yes, an equitable and sustainable development is possible. I would mobilize all tools of macroeconomic policy to achieve full employment with decent jobs, equality and ecological sustainability. That requires using your fiscal policy. Public investment is the core of that. Not just monetary policy, but also monetary policy, and more smartly than our central banks are doing at the moment. Labour market policies for a level playing field between labour and capital, and industrial policy. I'll say one word about public investment and fiscal policy here, because it again ties back to the idea of debt. Now, public investment priorities should focus on all our goals. Well, that requires, of course, green investment in infrastructure, in renewable energy, housing, public transport. And if the government doesn't lead the way here with public investment, it will be too little too late. But the government also has to see that it's not just physical infrastructure where we are having a deficit. We have an ecological deficit, but we have a care deficit as well. So we need to also pave the way with public investment to create a social infrastructure to address the deficit in education, health, social care and childcare. Well, because if the government doesn't do it, women are doing it, because children don't grow on trees, somebody got to do it. It's being provided by the unpaid, invisible domestic labor of women. So here is the importance of course, if you're serious about equality, not just among men, but also men and women, you need to see how you have to lead the way to provide what feminists call a purple social infrastructure. Now, how to finance it? Of course, again, use all your tools. Progressive taxation on not just income, but wealth is important. That also sorts out inequality that breeds instability. You have to, again, talk about, however, also public borrowing. Without public borrowing, you will have to rely on someone else accumulating debt, and the UK has been relying on us households building debt, because borrowing by the public sector is a taboo. There are other tools, National Investment Bank, and monetary policy is important, but it has to serve the needs of fiscal spending and a National Investment Bank priorities. I'm only going to talk about public borrowing here, because in the UK that's important. We have now a progressive labour leadership in the Labour Party, and they say we will invest in infrastructure, and if need be, we will not just tax but also borrow. But they have developed a fiscal credibility rule that says borrow only for public infrastructure investment, and for the rest of the spending, current spending, we will rely on our tax revenues. At the first sight, it looks quite all right. First of all, of course, the impact of borrowing, if you're spending it on infrastructure, on public budget, eventually will sort it out itself. In the short run, if you spend more, that will create demand in the economy through what we call the multiplier mechanisms technically. It will self-finance part of itself. So there is money. In the long run, of course, infrastructure, public spending will create higher productivity. Another student of mine, not anymore, Eurydice, who is sitting here, who will also start at Goldsmiths as a lecturer, by the way, soon, has been actually looking at that with us in a joint paper, where we find that public spending does increase productivity. So that's all fine. But the critical question we are asking, well, I have many heads, a Keynesian, inspired by Marxist economics, and a feminist. One question feminist economists in the UK ask, Women's Budget Group, with whom I work, what is infrastructure? Is it just the railways and renewable energy and housing? Well, no, we say infrastructure includes social infrastructure in the care economy, in our children, in our elderly. It includes education, childcare, health, and social care. Currently, it's important for you to understand as citizens and researchers, public spending in these items. If I pay to a nurse, a doctor, a nursery teacher, or a teacher for that matter, this is seen as just current spending. It is not seen as investment in our national accounts, so it doesn't go into the fiscal credibility rule of the Labour Party. What we are saying is, revise your credibility rule, if need be, borrow also to invest in social infrastructure and not just public infrastructure. I'll end by just saying, okay, if you want recovery and sustainability, you need green and purple public investment for public jobs with men and women and a pay rise for both and shorter hours for everyone. I didn't talk about the latter. So I'll end by saying, take care of employment, decent pay for men and women, equality and ecological sustainability. Your budget, government budget, will take care of itself. Don't worry about it.
Thank you so much, Osman, for that. Thank you. Next up is Ona Palmer.
Thank you. So,
can you hear me? So, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you to all the students who are organizing this. I'm really impressed by this amazing event. I come from a background in philosophy and cultural studies, so economics is something that I've always been very intimidated by. So, unlike what is said in the description of my bio, I don't focus on primitive accumulation in Romania. I've just finished a PhD on the Tunisian Revolution, actually. So this is my first attempt to start making sense of what has happened in Romania after communism. So bear with me. This is going to be a very sort of angry take at economy. Okay, so this line of thought and questions was born a long time ago, and I want to share with you two of its most relevant moments. In the 2000s, during my stay in Italy, I read a book written by a whistleblower, Andrea Segre. It was called The Lords of Transition, written in 1999. The author confessed how, as a transitional agronomist, he implemented agricultural aid programs in the ex-socialist bloc. As you can imagine, with this book, he attempted to redeem himself from the destructive function that he held in most of the countries he visited. The other moment is happening in the end of the 90s in Romania and was described to me by a witness. In a ministry building, a man is desperately trying to meet the industry minister, but is constantly rejected. He vents out in the next office. The foreign experts, he says, have decreed that the pig farm that he's a director of be closed because inefficient and unsustainable. His pig farm is one of those massive state complexes and raises tens of thousands of pigs. The electricity has been cut. The man has tears running down his cheeks. He has traveled from far away to come to Bucharest. I'm here to tell them they can't close us down from one day to another. They didn't even give us the time to slaughter our animals. It's hell in there without food or electricity. The pigs are so hungry that they are eating the barbed wire surrounding the farm. These are the two main moments, among so many others, that led me to the haunting question, what happened to us? When I say us, I mean us Romanians, Europe's last arrivals. And my interest is to make sense of how the post-communist transition has, one, destructured our society, and two, built us within different social, economic, and identity parameters. As follows, I will describe what the post-communist transition entailed, attempting to connect it to theories of accumulation by dispossession. Furthermore, I will reflect on how transition created new identities and show examples of intellectual practices which are currently building an understanding of this cultural colonization while actively supporting a decolonial direction. For a Western observer, Romania after communism is an imaginary space characterized by images of violence, like the revolution, poverty, orphanages, children living in the sewers, demonization of Roma communities abroad, and an immature state structure allegedly defined by corruption. These are features of transition from communism to market economy, because in Romania, capitalism as a term was not employed until recently. From state party rule to democracy. In this transitional condition, we feel forever trapped, never fully reaching that destination of complete or satisfying Europeanness, capitalism, democracy. Yet it's worth also briefly mentioning some structural aspects of what transition has meant so far in terms of the true restructuration of the Romanian society. Transition has meant turbo deindustrialization led by the external creditors like the IMF, the same IMF who had advised the communist government to impose austerity measures before '89. The closure of hundreds of factories, the loss of 2.5 million jobs, and our country's regression to levels of GDP industrial outputs lower than the ones before industrialization in the 40s. This came along with a significant integration within the debt economy, which in 2017 was 49.7% of Romania's GDP, around 95 billion euros. Maybe as a consequence, Romania got dispersed, in the sense that it grew heavily diasporized. It now bears the second highest emigration growth rate, 7.3%, after Syria, a country devoured by civil war. The at least 3.5 million Romanians working abroad have sent $4.9 billion in remittances in 2017, basically reinventing the country's economic flows. Yet how does this relate to the primitive accumulation discussed by Adam Smith and Karl Marx? As many have argued, this phenomenon doesn't only mark the passage from feudalist to capitalist, but can be applied every time dispossession commodifies labor power, making it available to exploitation. In fact, drawing from David Harvey and the modernity coloniality school, the Romanian decolonial thinker Ovidiu Țicindeleanu explains, post-communist transition meant the reintegration of Romania and of Eastern Europe in the semi-periphery of global capital. It meant the local recreation of the structural dependencies and of the hierarchies of the modern colonial world. More than that, transition meant the voluntary offer of one's own territory to the armed force that was, at the time, the main agent of military invasion. The period of the first transition was one marked by primitive accumulation of capital and by the creation of quasi-monopolies, achieved through deindustrialization, devaluation, and aggressive dispossession, alongside the fragmentation and reduction of communities to bare life and to mere labor force. Țicindeleanu divides the elements of transition, a period hegemonized by anti-communism, Eurocentrism, and capitalocentrism, in negative and positive. The negative elements are centered around the primitive accumulation, connected to the arrival of the strategic, quote-unquote, strategic investors, the development of usury, of mafia-style systems of interest and protection, and finally to the explosion of theft and murder rates. However, what also unfolded during transition was the neoliberal attack on health and education, previously state-led and free, the privatization of common goods and services, and the mass uprooting of labor force. Among the positive elements, positive in terms of what new dimensions this transition period constructed, he described the emergence of cultural industries and governance bodies based on Western models, the normativization of public spaces, the proliferation of the fetishism of consumption and immediate satisfaction, and the birth of the new local civilized subject in constant and never achieved aspiration towards its European Western identity. I should maybe change the title question then, the initial question, into what happened to us when we became capitalists. Drawing from the decolonial thinker Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Țicindeleanu argues that a society isn't capitalist when all the social and economic relations are capitalist, but when the capitalist relations determine the way in which all economic and social relations work in a society. In other words, when the capitalist world subjects all the other social worlds. End quote. This point is made to raise questions around the past and present coexistence of capitalist and non-capitalist types of social relations, of informal economies, of informal knowledges. Because of the hegemonic anti-communism, the erasure of our past, with all its alternative epistemic and economic universes, led to our isolation within the permanent post-communist present of transition. And transition we should liberate ourselves from. Time to work on resistance tactics within the coexistence with capitalism, while acknowledging our colonial present and building decolonial solidarities. This piece doesn't have a conclusion because it is just the beginning of piecing back together what processes I'm a result of. One conclusion I can already draw, though: the dispossession of spaces like Romania has granted one more chance to Western centers of accumulation.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I'm not sure if you can handle some more amazing, knowledge thrown upon you, but Jonah is next on the panel.
Okay, I'll just stand and try to talk really loudly. If I can just find a place. Okay, I'm really glad to come across after these two. I think it fits really well because my work is, as a political economist, runs in between kind of economic analysis and cultural economy, looking at transformation. So when I talk about debt and austerity, for me, what is critical about understanding about austerity is very much a story about debt. And I think it's helpful to imagine that austerity doesn't just exist in Britain after 2010 when George Osborne sort of declares that we're going to tighten our belts, right? Austerity has quite a long institutional history that's already been alluded to, which if we kind of imagine the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement happens in the mid-70s, from the late 70s until now, we have had ever more persistent and larger in magnitude financial crisis. We can start with the third world debt crisis. We can start with savings and loan. We could point to long-term capital management crisis. We can point to Black Wednesday, Black Monday. The list goes on. 2001, 1997. It just keeps getting more intense, the crisis. And with every crisis comes a period of austerity. If you were under IMF governance, it was called structural adjustment. So we need to stop imagining that crisis is some crazy, manic, panic, crash. Nobody sees it coming. How did this happen? Okay, it is part and parcel of the growth model that has been developed since the fall of Bretton Woods. So austerity is not unique to Britain. It's not even unique to 2008. It's just what we're living in now as a financial crisis has grown in magnitude, spread across into other aspects, become deeper within the economy and society, so too has austerity. So that's the kind of context that I want us to kind of think about debt and austerity, that it's bigger than today, but really I'm just talking about today. So the story of debt is really one that threads through, that makes that connection between the crisis and the post-crisis, right? Because debt is what it's all about in this context. So if we imagine that debt begins as a panacea, right? So we have, Positive Money. I'll mention them because they do excellent little web videos that I assign my students to understand that private banks make money. And to be fair, they've always made money, open market operations. This is not a hugely revolutionary statement, but let's think about it in this growth model that was alluded to here on the slide. What does that mean for a bank? So a bank issues a loan, and when it makes that loan, money is created. They don't have to have reserves. They don't have to have some level of gold in the vault, right? They issue money. This is already a great commercial power to have, right? I'll just make money. Literally make it. I don't have to make money like everyone else. I just make it, right? But it's not just that they make money. It's that they have the regulatory ability to charge whatever interest rate they deem appropriate on that money. So this is how people ask questions. Well, how is finance discriminatory, right? What does it matter that you're a woman, or that you are Latina living in an urban community, or that you're a Black single mother? Why does that matter to credit? Isn't it all just allocated? No. It is precisely because the bank can decide that based on your risk profile, and if you're a single mother, if you're dark-skinned, if you live in a poor neighborhood in a poor postal code, you will pay more for that credit. Because the bank determines how much they pay you. That's their right, their regulatory right. And they say it's related to your risk profile. So they can make the money from nothing, they can charge what they like to lend it on, and then what they have is a legal claim to chase you down using whatever means they feel necessary to make you pay that debt. Okay, and if you're a student loan, right, that's a government-backed debt in which the tax man chases you down for that money. Okay, so these are really quite strong commercial powers that no other sector, no other firm, no other business industry has the kind of legal regulatory right to perform. So this is the power of debt. Okay? So a lot of people talk about it as a social relation. I like to think of it as a social force because debt has power, so it has the ability to change things. So what initially emerges is that the banks develop quite a profitable business model, which we call originate and distribute. They originate loans, they give the loans, they give you the interest rate, they give you the term of the contract, right? Cha-ching, cha-ching, making money all the time, right? Then they develop this really great new ability, regulatory ability, to then bundle all the loans that they've issued together and move them into an offshore vehicle called the Loan Book One, and then make more money by selling ownership claims to your interest payments or to the interest payments of borrowers. So that's a new great ability, and it's just absolutely made a fortune. We're talking billions and billions and billions a day is roaming through debt securities because it's a very profitable business, as you can imagine. Well, this all starts out as great because, as we've already heard, wages were falling. We all need a little bit of credit, right? Plug that gap. We need a little loan. We want to go on holiday, we get a loan. We want renovations, we get a loan. Want to go to school, get a loan. Grandma's sick, get a loan. The kids need new shoes, get a loan, right? It just really plugged the gap really nicely there for a while, and it created a kind of general uplift, right? In which we could temporarily get ourselves over the problem of not making enough money in our wages. So now we have a sort of dependence here. The banks need to make loans for profits. Households need loans to sustain themselves, to maintain a middle-class existence that previously they paid for with good wages that were regularly going up. So then in comes the government. The government now also becomes dependent on the same debt that the banks are dependent on for profits, households are dependent on to sustain themselves. The government now becomes dependent on debt to drive growth. Because, well, just like the story that we already heard from Oslam, right? The system doesn't necessarily create uplift, right? There's a winning without a victory, right? And the problems in the economy begin to fester. So then we have our crisis. Again, debt is the cause of the crisis. And quickly, debt becomes a poison pill. So it goes from being a cure-all solution to all your economic ills to being actually the source of huge economic problems. So I call this the Homer Simpson problem. So Homer Simpson says to his wife, "Marge, I have a problem with alcohol. It is the cause of and the solution to all of my problems." and this is what debt has become, right? It is both the cause of and the solution to all of our problems, private debt. So now that we live in this kind of state of mutual dependence on debt, debt is not an option anymore. It is a necessity. It's a necessity to go to school. It's a necessity to participate in the labor market. It's a necessity to access home. It's required to be in debt. When previously, mortgages were much smaller, wages were growing. So who in society is negatively affected by debt really depends on how old you are, right? When you were born. I mean, don't you wish you had more control over that? When economists have talked to you about what choices you make. So, you know, how old you are, how close you live to the urban center, and how well your parents did on the property market level, right? So these are the kind of determinants. The younger you are, closer you live to an urban center, the more likely you are to be heavily in debt. So this has given rise to moments of resistance. So through this kind of debt economy, as debt has linked across crisis to austerity, we see this bubbling up of forms of political resistance because debt is a force, right? It is forcing change and reconfiguration. So I've just finished a body of research looking at different forms of debt resistance, and I'll go through those briefly before I present my claim, my push for change. So the different spaces of debt resistance that have emerged in austerity in the United States and Europe has been, first of all, to challenge government debt. Because again, a story of debt and austerity is one that tends to almost always be framed around public debt, right? So public debt is the problem. We can't take on more public debt. So then resistance to debt has come through the auditing of national government debts in France, in Greece. And here this is about fundamentally challenging the redistributive role of the government. So if we're going to be making cutbacks, let's look, because of debt, let's look at what is the government cutting back on and what is it continuing to pay for? And it's asking fundamental questions about why is it bailouts for some and austerity for the rest, and really trying to bring that to the fore. The next element, which is related, is about local authority debts, kind of at the local level, which is at the UK and in Spain. And you can all speak to Fanny here, who is an activist involved in this work and will be shortly publishing on the debts of Newham Council here in London. So at the local authority level, what you see in the UK and Spain is that because austerity and debt-led austerity has pushed cuts down to the local level, what it did is create a form of debt resistance around how much debt should local authorities be taking, and justifiably because of austerity. So again, what I find most interesting here is that debt is not this passive relationship between creditor and borrower. It is becoming a political relationship around what is the purpose of credit and what is the purpose of the state. If the two of them are becoming aligned in order to download harm onto everyone else. So nobody believes that Newham Council caused the financial crisis, but everyone knows that Newham Council is going to pay for it. So to ask these questions fundamentally and really use it to re-question what credit is for and what the state is for. Then there's this kind of other aspect of debt resistance that I've looked at, which is people have a hard time, I have to do a bit of a sell job to say this is actually resistance, which is just personal debt, taking responsibility for your personal debt audits, so the growth of the debt freedom movement. So whether you call it debt freedom or freedom from debt, they have slightly different meanings, but it's people who commit to this debt-free journey. That I'm not going to live with debt anymore. My debt is causing me so much problems. I wake up every day and I'm worried about my mental health. My marriage is broken down. I can't live like this anymore. And they have it is a whole online community. They have support groups and so on, in which they're learning to care about their debt. And now some people would say, how is that resistance? Right? If I'm just taking responsibility for my debt, isn't that just individualization? Well, what I think is interesting here is that what you're doing when you're entering a debt-free journey is you're naming your debt. You're making it into a political formation. You're trying to understand it as something you need to act against. And I think in that moment, when we have these everyday aspects of austerity, those people engaging that are trying to understand the economy. They're making a bridge and to understand the forces of change that are being acted upon them. And I liked your question, which was, what is the society I'm a product of? So then to conclude, I'll just end with my own kind of, what all of this brought me to studying over the past few years, how people have kind of politically thought about debt, has been to ask, what can we do about it? For me, it's been 10 years. Okay, first of all, before the financial crisis, I was researching debt. Now, it's like I've spent a lot of time learning about every aspect of debt, how it's made, how it's distributed, different populations, and I can't oppose it anymore. I just need to just talk about it. I need to do something to oppose it now. So, as somebody who knows something about debt, I sat down to write a 25,000-word book, Should We Abolish Household Debts?, which I've only just finished. And it ended up being a very practical solution. I thought I'd be much more radical. Turns out I'm very dull indeed. About, how could we get rid of this problem that we call private debt? So the first proposal is to have a long-term refinancing operation. So all I'm advocating here is that we take the bailouts of the banks and the lenders. We accept that. That happened 10 years ago. It's done. We know how much we spent. We know what we have to show for it. I mean, isn't it grand? This great rebalancing, the great recovery we supposedly had, we're 10 years on. It's, right? Not going great. So give me half that money. Just half. I don't want the whole bailout. Give me half the cash guarantees you gave the bank and half the credit guarantees you gave the banks. And let's organize abolishing household debts. Now, what debts? First of all, I do not advocate abolishing the debts of worthy debtors. Okay? So you don't have to have so much. You don't have to be over indebted to qualify for debt cancellation. You need to only have a loan. So the first group I would target is anyone who got a loan since 2009. I'm saying if you got a loan since 2009, all of that is government-backed loans. And they cannot be charging you 8%, 6%, 5%. The going rate is 0.5%. That is what you will pay. Put it all into a long-term refinancing. Everybody gets a haircut. Everybody pays less for their debts. Because if the banks are getting it for negative real rates, zero bound, we'll pay you 0.5%. There's your profit right there. Okay? Because credit can operate as an economic utility. The next proposal I have is to cancel debts that originate before 2008, the old debts. So if you have a loan account that has been opened continuously that originated before 2009, that debt will be canceled. Because the lenders have already been bailed out. They've had their assets bought back, they've had their own loans refinanced, they've had countless guarantees. So if your debts are old, let's just, it's gone. We already bailed out the banks. We bailed out the lenders. Let's just bail out the borrowers as well. And through this combination, it will not eliminate the entire debt stock, but it will eliminate enough of it to get us out from underneath this mountain of debt that is sitting on top of the economy, which is, basically sucking, or I would say it's drowning it. Let's not say it's sucking light of it. It's drowning the economy. It's drowning in debt. And we are working every day just to pay back a debt stock that built up really now 15 years ago. And eliminating that debt stock will be that bit that pushes us in a new direction, one in which the economy and society can break free from this kind of debt dependency in which debt is a source of and the solution to all of our problems. We need to move away from a debt economy, and this is how you do it. What it does, it allows us to bail out households now and defer the costs later. So if we imagine that most debt says, well, actually you get the debt now and you pay it back later, we're going to bail out households now and the banks will incur losses later, over 7 years, because we'll just securitize, open a pool and allow them to use their own technology, the own vehicles, the own financial instruments that they created. We just rehack it, re-engineer it in order to distribute a bailout. Again, it's only half the price. 50% off a bailout. And of course, everybody's going to say, hey, but that's just going to cause a financial crisis. Guess what? Anything can cause a financial crisis. We could not cancel any debts, and there will still be a financial crisis. So we might as well have another financial crisis that actually redistributes the harm where it should be, which is the people who are the purveyors of crisis. They should pay for the crisis they create. Most of us just want to get on with it, don't we? We don't want to have to live in awe of whether the banks are doing well or not. That shouldn't be our problem, but it is our problem because debt is what we depend on for the economy to survive and the economy to survive. Thank you.
Because we've just heard so much information, that would be really, I'm going to give you all a minute and a half to chat to the person next to you because we're going to open it up to questions. So a minute and a half to chat and come
90 seconds.
Yeah, 90 seconds. So it sounded like you're all having really great chats and have so many questions. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I'm going to take 3 questions in each round. So first 3. And yeah. Anyone have a question?
There is one gentleman there.
Sorry. What?
Yeah. Speak up.
Me?
Yeah.
Really, one more question I wanted to ask Professor around. You mentioned on your slide, you didn't get to it quite, but you talked about reduce, redistribute, and recognise work. And then you ended with short working hours. I wonder if you could perhaps flesh out kind of what you mean by some of that, and then perhaps detail how you think you can get there on a kind of post-Keynesian.
You read my slides, thank you.
Another question? Yep.
I wonder if any of the panel feel that blockchain technology has any impact on the future of a debtless economy.
Blockchain technology?
Blockchain technology, Bitcoin, this kind of stuff.
Yes.
Okay. Another question?
I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the end of quantitative easing and how to think about like some of the things we talked about in terms of like wage growth or productivity growth.
End of what?
Quantitative easing.
Okay, end of Q.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to start with, so first question I'm going to open up.
We'll just do it in order.
Yep. So so reducing and redistributing and recognizing debt and how to get there. Yep.
Okay, so I should have probably be more specific when I was talking about recognized redistribution. I was talking about unpaid work. That was in the purple investment slide. So the idea there is I need a massive mobilization of public investment for physical and social infrastructure. And when I talk about social infrastructure, well, a lot of that is about the care economy, obviously, childcare and elderly care. It's easy for people to absorb the idea of education and health services that we're all using. With respect to childcare and elderly care, I'm also seeing a certain resistance that people actually want to care for their children and elderly, whereas I want to socialize that and I want to get a more active public universal childcare and universal social care system going. And this is why I feel the need that I have to be specific there. And I'm referring to, actually, it's a quote from Diane Nelson, one of the leading feminist economists in the world, in this country as well. She says, we first have to recognize that there is unpaid care work that is happening. But we also have to reduce it, not that we don't care for our children or elderly, we want to care for them, but if you're doing it day in, day out, it becomes daunting and exhausting. We want to also have time for other things, and also, for paid work, but also for voluntary activism, or for myself simply. And this is not something selfish, so we need to reduce the amount of unpaid care work that each of us does. And there is always need for some unpaid work because our children want time with us, and our mothers and fathers or disabled relatives deserve time with us. Then we have to distribute it equally between different genders. Men should care as well as women. And of course, all that becomes a lot more pleasurable and easier done than said if we are not working day in, day out just to make a living, and where there is no balance between our work and our life. And I'm not just saying family and work balance, I'm saying life. I want a life. I don't want to work long, and I do want to spend time with my friends as well as people to depend on me. So that requires really thinking about a very progressive idea about shortening working hours. And that requires, of course, thinking about productivity gains, because shorter hours have been the basic gain of the working class movement. Compared to the 19th century, we are all working part-time today. That has stopped in the 80s very dramatically, despite a massive technological change and increases in our productivity. It's all going to capital. A way of redistributing income and giving people a pay rise and rebalancing the wage and profit share is to shorten the hours with a wage compensation for hourly wage, particularly for people who are just making ends meet, who are earning just in the middle or below. Right? Some other people who are anyway earning in the top 10% or 20% of the wage distribution may be very happy to work shorter hours and earn less, particularly though if it is all happening in the structure, in the context where we share some risks. So if I don't have to worry about my pension or what happens to me if I really get seriously sick, I get cancer, if there's public provision of social care for old age, for health care, a decent pension, I don't maybe need to kill myself to earn too much because risks will be shared, isn't it? So it's all about really how do we free ourselves, depends a lot on thinking about all dimensions. And I suppose, of course, the end of quantitative easing, I don't want to necessarily take someone else's question, but we've relied so much on the poor central bankers to deal with a massive problem we are sitting on, and quantitative easing has been very ineffective. They're not cutting this lifeline. It's the only lifeline of the economy, but very mainstream central bankers of the world, European central banks, governor or Bank of England's governor, economists have been screaming now to the government that interest rates are so low, please do something, spend a little bit, do fiscal policy. There's so much deficit in the economy. I'm sure we won't agree with them in terms of what are the needs, what are the priorities of fiscal policy, but even very mainstream economists are screaming. We're out of ammunition. Quantitative easing isn't going to do the job anymore. So yes, end of QE is not going to come if the government doesn't put its money where its mouth is, doesn't put its hand in its pocket in Europe, in the US, or in Britain, for that matter. Thank you.
And I also thought, in terms of reducing and redistributing and recognizing what also Mr. said, it's really interesting as well in how it relates as well to the displacement of people, which is what you were talking about in terms of dispossession. And I wondered if you had anything to add onto that.
Well, I'm just going to make one very small sort of observation. I don't think I have that knowledge to actually intervene in this debate. But what I can say is that definitely sort of immigration, so from the prospect of the West, the immigration especially of Romanian nationals has basically covered that huge gap in precisely the social infrastructures that you're talking about. And the deficit of care has mainly been covered. I've lived most of my migrant life in Italy, and that's where most of the care deficit has been covered by Romanian nationals. At the same time, from the perspective of Eastern Europe, of Romania, creating a huge gap of, there's actually a mental health condition called the Syndrome Italy, which precisely is concerned with the mental health of young children who are left behind while the women go in the West, mainly in Italy, to take care of somebody else's children. So there's this sort of like a different type of trickle down of dispossession, and I think it intersects a lot with the things you're saying about the social infrastructure. That's what I think I can add to this.
Thank you. It's very important.
That's very strong.
And Jonah, please.
Yeah, so in terms of blockchain, I think that, I don't speak here as an expert, but I do think one of the interesting prospects, I do think that, with all the baggage of Bitcoin set aside for a moment and just the basic technology, that where I think it really could have quite revolutionary impact is in the payment system. So credit and how the kind of infrastructure of the payment system is how credit operates on such a vast scale. And that actually, isn't totally owned by banks, but it's completely privately owned. And who controls the payment systems and on what terms? So the credit card companies, for example, own the payment systems around the clearinghouses and so on. So if blockchain could be reimagined to make the payment system like a public utility, that's where I think blockchain provides us with a kind of off-the-shelf solution that we can develop and use technology. We don't need one private company or two private companies controlling the payment system, whether it's PayPal or iPay or MasterCard or whoever. That's what they're doing, is operating in-house payment systems that generate their own types of money, right? Is that blockchain could allow money to be, and the payment system to be operated in an open way, potentially, but that's quite futuristic. But I do see that there is a role, and that we're all sort of, these different types of monies that are emerging. I don't know if anybody's seen the new book on it. I think it's called Dongle, but it's by Bill Mora, and he talks about all the emergent types of electronic money that are coming out that we use all the time to think about. Again, now when you're Apple, really what you want is people to go into debt. You want to charge people interest for money that doesn't even exist really anywhere but in a spreadsheet. But we need to, not always have such a rent-seeking attitude towards credit. And the question about quantitative easing, I think what I'm advocating for, again, I'm not such a purist in this idea that it's either monetary policy or fiscal policy. I think like QE for the people that Positive Money did, that's where everybody gets really upset. Like, but it's fiscal policy and we shouldn't do monetary policy. And I think that we're kind of moving into this world like where hybridity is probably more needed than orthodoxy and categories. What I would say is that quantitative easing, if it's going to be renewed, which it probably will. We're already keeping interest rates rock bottom. That's pretty clear. Is that it needs to be renewed in a way in which asset buybacks are buying back, let's say, the assets of cancelled debts, the long-term refinance debts, where funding for lending is being given to and passed on to consumers at low interest rates. How is it that you get funding for lending from the Bank of England and you charge somebody, 1% on an £8 billion loan, but students are paying 6.3 on a student loan? Either funding for lending is going to become a generalized, benefit. If we're giving government-backed loans to pass on to households, then please pass on the savings onto households as well. And I think that it's about and I don't think the central bankers are so adverse to these ideas, but it is about pushing at that door and again, becoming educated in economics if you're a campaigner and to know how to push these issues further.
May I add something on that? Sorry, that's a very interesting discussion. Actually, this was something I wanted to say when I was mentioning National Investment Bank or monetary policy, speaking to the other parts of the economic policy tools. Obviously, one way to use quantitative easing is basically to ask the Bank of England to buy bonds from the government directly, and it's a total taboo what I'm saying, really. I'm almost untouchable, and actually Bank of England as well as other central bankers would object to that very fiercely because they say it will intervene in our independence, but what I would advocate is the government has to have a credible plan about smart, innovative, long-term investment to address the deficits in our society, in our social fabric, social versus physical infrastructure both, and central bank can buy bonds from the government to finance that. This is one other way of QE, to finance fiscal policy outright by using money creation by the central bank. I'm not saying it as something that is uncontested. Just to clarify, it may sound very logical and common wisdom what I'm saying. It is a very provocative thing. Nobody would dare in the current political environment to queue behind what I'm saying. Just to, again, qualify for the Labour Party, who is opening up a lot of debate. We wrote a report on the National Investment Bank, but it's only in the appendix where we are suggesting Bank of England maybe can buy the bonds from an independent national investment bank, not the government, who will then fund some investment projects by cooperatives, third party, but also small businesses. Again, this is, if you say it to the Bank of England, they would freak out. And just to add to that, we are advocating it, but it's not the main policy of Labour Party. National Investment Bank will not use Bank of England money at the moment as it is formulated by the Labour Party. And I don't know if you have noticed, but last week Labour Party proposed that the Bank of England should have a second remit, not just inflation targeting, but productivity targeting. In my opinion, it should have been full employment targeting, but never mind. Immediately on the same day, Bank of England, including Andy Haldane, who is always very sympathetic to rethinking economics movement, said, oh, it's not our remit, we can't do that. It's something they see as they will touch their independence. Whereas I'm saying Bank of England shouldn't be independent from an elected parliament, representatives of the people. It should, however, be independent from the financial markets and vested interests. Okay, these are very radical thoughts.
Careful.
Just to make it clear.
These can explode later.
Very sensible to you. Well, if so, campaign for it, but it is not easy to get a lot of actors with you around them.
Can I just add one more thing to this? That no, this is the problem that I have with central bank independence, is not a single central banker will ever have any problem thinking that they should be taking, and they do already get Treasury bill, the money that they use to fund it is all from the Treasury, to buy Apple shares. I mean, when you look at the portfolio of assets they're buying with QE, it's Apple, it's Microsoft. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's Starbucks, companies that don't even pay tax in this country are getting tax-funded payer investments in their equities that they then just profit from directly. And no central banker questions the ethics or the morality of doing that and saying, aren't we just artificially creating hyperinflation in equity markets? They never ask that question, even though they are doing exactly that. Instead, they turn around and say, no, you're going to mess with our independence if you say we should invest in something besides corporate equity. I mean, there's no problem in corporate equity markets right now. There's literally problems everywhere else. But this is the only place that they make a decision. And you can't question them without them saying, you might be attacking my independence. Well, if that's your independence, it's rubbish. Anyway.
Thank you. And also, I just have something to add real quick, that in terms of the blockchain question, at blockchain and all these the news, it's great and it's really amazing that this technology is advancing. But at the same time, lots of banks are shutting down. So, which published a study last week which showed that the cash machines are shutting at 300 cash machines are shutting each month, which is crazy because people need cash machines. And I think I think the minority of people are moving on to these technologies, but then the rest of the population aren't people in peripheral areas of the UK. So old people living in the north, and it's great that technology is changing and moving forward, but at the same time, it's not being done in a way that's representative and good for everyone. But I'm going to take the last round of 3 questions, and because we're just running a bit behind, so I'm going to take the last round of 3 questions, and then we'll run through them. Yes.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the discussion, especially around I suppose my question is really about debt, and I suppose it quickly directed to German. I suppose debt is an example of a deeper malaise in how we have structured the economy, which is based on rentier kind of capitalism, which is that there are a group of people, private interested individuals who have ownership of scarce resources and are able to make money by doing nothing, whether it be through money, rent on money, or whether it be land, through charging outrageous rates on, for example, student rent, for instance. These are all examples of how monopolies have huge ownership and control over things that we need for our survival, whether it be money, credit to pay for our healthcare or to buy cars, for instance. So if that is the case, I suppose then surely part of the solution then would be to nationalise some of those resources, to take back control of those scarce resources, so it denies those capitalist private individuals the means to use their power to charge outrageous rates, or to undertake predatory lending, as what happened with the major commercial banks. So whilst I agree with your part about the haircut, I was just wondering, is there a more structural solution, which is about taking back control of scarce resources?
Thank you. Next question? Yeah.
I have kind of 2 parts that are related with engaging with mainstream economists. So one is where do you see the role of engaging with mainstream economists or economists that are in positions of political influence with these issues? And the other kind of follows on from that. My background is history and anthropology, and whether you have any advice for someone like me with a more qualitative or humanities background who's interested in these kinds of issues and tends to go happen with that kind of perspective, but wants to engage more or understand kind of economic perspectives and the technical language and so on, so as to better kind of argue against them.
Can I take another question? I'm going to take, because of the all-woman panel, I'm going to end with a woman question. You get the last question.
Just wanted to ask about, earlier you spoke about risk profiling when you give that out. Just wondering if you had an alternative model that doesn't maybe focus so much on like socio-economic circumstances. Like, is there any alternative
Thank you for those questions.
And people can come and
Yeah.
find us in the break if they want to make further points.
I think maybe to start off with a raw, going from, qualitative to a more quantitative approach, and I think that would be a really good question for you, Anna.
Well, I don't know. Honestly, my only advice would be to, focus on the events that you would like to understand, or really follow all the amazing sort of stimuli today, for example, and just starting from a qualitative perspective, I would say the way to understand the dynamics of economics, which I have completely not understood, is by really engaging with the type of event that you want to make sense of. So I think in this case, debt and austerity actually provides you with the motivation of engaging with highly abstract theories and, logics, precisely because you want to understand what debt and austerity are about. So if you feel that push towards approaching quite complex topics like the ones we heard about today, then just go for it. And I think that's where the skill will be developed.
And just to sort of add on to that and further question, and how would you find, as someone also who's come from a qualitative background, going into economics, how do you find, the differences in the evaluating of what is, like rationalist thought and like subjective thought, like what is truth, or over just what would you think about that? So.
Oh, okay. What the difference between rationalist and subjective, you said?
Yeah, so, like when I find...
First, do away with dualism.
Yes, basically. And
Number one.
It's awful. But, how have you, like, navigated, because I found, like, economics is a very, like, male-dominated sort of field that tends to think that, like, cultural, it sort of just puts hierarchy over what certain knowledge is important knowledge. And I think your presentation was doing really good in, like, bringing those two things together and saying, like, look, this is, important.
I think in particular, I would, if I would imagine taking this further, and I know about a lot of sources that I would work with, the difficulty would also be into dealing with, like, a lot of economic documents, like propaganda economic documents. So I think it's really difficult to figure out what the sort of hierarchy of sources are between sort of a lot of marginalized histories of dispossession, the whole intersectional sort of approach that we all want to have, the sort of propaganda narratives, the neoliberal narratives, the critical economists. So I would say there's no recipe for that. It's a case-by-case, choice, no? And it's a very tough one, I would say. I don't know what you would add to that. How do you define the sort of hierarchy of sources, and how do you put together sort of structural propositions alongside the sort of histories of it that also...
For me, I think about it in terms of registers, right? So I think about it in terms of like empirical registers, where you have, what is the language, what is, economics has a very rigid register of what it counts, quite literally counts in a very narrow-minded way as the economy. And how they create that register and all is already well documented. But for me, I think of it as, well, here's the register of economics. And when economists and people who speak about economics use these categories and the language of numbers to explain change, what the qualitative, what I think is the advantage, right? I do mix methods, so I say this sincerely, that qualitative evidence has a very, very strong advantage over quantitative evidence. Because number one, it can be communicated more simply and reused more easily by people who are end users, right? So the people you're pitching to. I worked at a research center in the wake of the financial crisis with Deutsche, Citi, every major economist from the major banks saying to me, where can I get this kind of stuff? I mean, I have a million number crunchers, but none of them could explain it like that. Because there is a way in which quantification is dominant, but it is not monolithic. And to just think about it in that terms. And I think about it in terms of corroboration. So if I can find a quantitative example, a quantitative analysis that shows this trend, and then I can corroborate it with really in-depth qualitative analysis, I have a basis for making a claim about change. But
Shona, I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
So we've just got like 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
So if any of you want to touch on the last
the
other
rent,
two questions. Sorry.
So the rent-seeking question, I totally agree. The only part that is slightly, because I do talk about it in terms of rent-seeking, that I would change is that credit is not scarce. Precisely because it can be made. It just exists in vast digital server farms, right? There is absolutely no scarcity of credit. So when David Cameron puts up a sign and says, sorry, there is no money, or I think that was actually a Treasury person that put that. I mean, it's actually a lie. There is more money. That's why we have trillions and billionaires and trillionaires. There's lots of money. You just don't have any access to it. And I think that that's the kind of difference in terms of why I don't think we need to nationalize. Because the problem is not scarcity, right? The problem is the mechanisms that we have for treating credit like a public utility. And in risk-based pricing, I'd really like to think about that more. I think that's an excellent question, is what I'm saying. I'm really going to think hard. Off the top of my head, I would say you could get a better profile. I mean, again, if credit's used like an economic utility, we're not pricing interest based on a desire for profit. Interest is about distributing credit. But I would say something like, wouldn't we be better off giving everybody at 18 a £5,000 line of credit and base our risk profile based on how they actually use it instead of just like racist tropes? Really, they really explain the entire subprime mortgage credit, which is an absolute, if the one thing you take away from my talk, it was an absolute lie. It was not Black and Latina single women with a desire for a big house that caused the financial crisis. It's a lie. They didn't do it. It wasn't their fault. It was just a story that everybody easily believed. And that was what risk-based pricing said. They just used that story, to distract. So I think that it's important that risk-based profiling be taken to task for what it doesn't do anything except for reproduce stories that we and prejudices that we have to justify making people pay more for credit.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll actually say a few things about your point. I absolutely agree that financial sector is one of the key sectors which has to be publicly or collectively owned. I have a list of sectors where I don't want the things to market. That includes health, education, pension, care, public transport, a large part of housing, but it does cover finance. Now, how do we go about that? Well, we had actually nationalized some of them. We should have never sold them to begin with. So we should have used the crisis. Having not done it, how would I go if I were advising a progressive government? I would try to grow our own. So we need some large banks. They shouldn't be, however, privately owned. So large national or regional development banks to finance large projects. And cooperatives, because we all need to save a little bit for future or take a loan one day. Mm-hmm. These have to be in the form of cooperatives. Let's grow our own. In the Labour Party document on National Investment Bank we wrote, we also said National Investment Bank will use some local challenger banks. Give them criteria how they should be operating. How do they lend? How do they manage corporate governance? what is the CEO being paid, and where are they giving credit in their day business in the private sector as a private firm? Do they meet our industrial strategy criteria? Well, if so, work with these challenger banks. And I did speak at Bloomberg about the National Investment Bank at an event of the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, and they were asking me, would the financial sector work with you? Well, they will queue to work with us, because by growing our own, we are going to suffocate the bad practice in the rest of the business. But obviously, there is also need for financial regulation in terms of breaking up the large banks, and this is a job that hasn't been done after this crisis. So this is one of the ways, trying to limit the area of private banks, make them small, and grow our own until there is probably more power in the community to really own that collectively. And by that, I don't just mean state ownership. So one last word about mainstream economics and how we work with that. I'm an economist. I work with quantitative methods, and I don't think this is the only method. Just that's what I do. This is what I know better, let's say, and this is very important, I think, to put into context of other methods and have multi-method research in cooperation. But what I do with mainstream economists is this. I use quantitative methods to debunk their myths, what they think to be waterproof research. It's actually like full of holes. And I use that to campaign, to give ammunition to actors. That can be a progressive political party, social movement, a trade union. I work always with other actors. And I think mainstream economics will only change when we vote with our feet, we take a political stance, and this is now a message to rethinking economics movement. Without taking a political stance, we're not going to change the teaching of economics, the recruitment of lecturers to teach economics, or what does the Treasury find its graduates to do economic policy that shapes your life. And I have seen in South Korea a movement when the government said to the civil servants who are all trained in Ivy League universities of the world, neoclassical, they said, we have invited these people, now invite them and listen to them. So we had a closed meeting with civil servants. They couldn't care less about the sort of thing I was talking about today, equality-led development, wage-led development, increasing wages is what you need for stability. Normally they wouldn't level with us. Now they have to, because the government is ringing them. These are the people you need to now listen to. So this is how change will happen. Change is not going to happen because I'm writing beautiful papers in my office, which I think I am, but, and trying to publish that and, breeding new people. Change will not come from that. I'm doing my job, but change will come when we change, when we take power. There are many ways to that, but yes, we need to think about taking power. Otherwise, reading economics, I think, is a little bit slowing down.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As to conclude, I'd like to thank Rethinking the New School of Economics for inviting us all here, and for all of you for even coming on a Saturday night. There's football, it's Pride, there's a lot of things happening, but it's hot. So thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers as well. Thank you.